Your alarm didn't go off this morning, not because you forgot to set it, but because you don't own one anymore. You wake up whenever your body decides it's had enough sleep, which today was 7:23, and you brewed some coffee and stood by the kitchen window for 11 straight minutes, watching your neighbor reverse out of his driveway and slide into that endless line of weekday traffic that flows down your street every single morning, always in the same direction, like a river that never changes course. He looked exhausted. He never glanced up. You're 35, you haven't held a job in 4 months, and you're not looking for one either. This isn't a tale about good fortune. There was no inheritance waiting for you, no lucky windfall, no stock options that happened to vest at the perfect moment and made your life effortless. What there was instead was a spreadsheet, a savings rate that made people visibly uncomfortable whenever you brought it up, and 8 straight years of turning down things that everyone around you was eagerly saying yes to. This is the real story of what that choice actually cost you, and what it actually bought you in return, and why the word retirement doesn't quite capture what your life looks like now. It began at 27, not with some grand revelation, not with a book that flipped a switch in your brain, not with a podcast episode that rewired how you thought. It began with one number on a paycheck and a completely different number sitting in your bank account. And that quiet, nauseating realization that the gap between those two numbers was almost non-existent, even after 5 full years of working nonstop. You were pulling in $74,000 a year as a project coordinator at a mid-sized software company, in a city expensive enough that it actually mattered. After taxes, after the retirement contribution you'd left at the bare minimum because you didn't fully understand how it worked yet. After rent and your car payment and all the everyday costs of simply existing as a person in your late 20s, you were managing to save somewhere between $200 and $400 a month. You weren't blowing money carelessly. You didn't have some out-of-control shopping habit or a going-out problem, none of those specific bad habits that finance influencers love pinning on people who aren't building any wealth. You were simply living the life that was available to you at the price that life demanded, and the numbers just weren't adding up. That feeling right there is where this really starts. Not the spreadsheet, not some calculated savings percentage. It's the feeling of staring at 5 years of full-time work and realizing you had almost nothing to show for it that was actually growing on its own. That night you went home, opened your laptop, and typed a question into the search bar you'd never typed before. How much money would you actually need to never work again? You weren't being serious, not exactly, but you were the kind of not serious that's secretly very serious underneath. The kind that keeps that browser tab open for 3 hours straight. What you discovered had a name. FIRE. Financial independence. Retire early. You'd heard the term thrown around before, the way you hear things before you truly understand them. More as a label for a type of person than an actual set of numbers. Extreme savers, people who ate rice and beans every night, drove cars that were 15 years old, and turned down every vacation. You'd mentally filed it under interesting but not for me, and moved on with your day. What you found that night, reading with a kind of focus that only comes from recognizing something directly relevant to your own life, was that the core idea was far simpler than the culture built around it made it seem. If you save up 25 times your yearly expenses and invest that money into low-cost index funds tracking the broader market, historical data suggests you could withdraw 4% of that total every single year, indefinitely, without ever running dry. This math, known as the 4% rule, traces back to a 1998 study from Trinity University that reviewed decades of market performance and concluded, a stock-heavy portfolio could support a 4% annual withdrawal across nearly every 30-year stretch in modern market history, even during the worst downturns. You sat with that math for a long while, not the general 4% rule itself, but your own personal version of it. What were your actual yearly expenses? You pulled up 12 months of bank statements and added everything up, a process that took roughly 40 minutes and revealed a number you'd never actually calculated before, simply because you'd never needed to: $38,000 a year. Rent, groceries, transportation, insurance, the occasional getaway, that morning coffee you grabbed from the shop 2 blocks from your office. Every last expense. $38,000. 25 times $38,000 landed at $950,000. At the time, you had $31,000 in your retirement account and $4,200 sitting in savings. The distance between those two numbers wasn't demoralizing at all. It was clarifying because now it was a real number attached to a real goal with a real tangible way to get there. Nothing vague about it, nothing dependent on luck, nothing hinging on some external factor breaking your way. Just a number, a rate, and a timeline that rested entirely on choices within your control. You didn't quit your job the following day. You didn't transform into someone else overnight. You made exactly two changes. You bumped your retirement contribution from 3% up to 22%, and you moved into a cheaper apartment. That's the entire intervention. Everything that followed took years to unfold. Your college roommate's name is Ben. He remains one of your closest friends, and he also happens to be, in the clearest and most efficient sense possible, a living example of the exact life you decided not to live. Not because his choices were bad ones, but because they were the default setting, the path of least resistance that finance culture, advertising, and social pressure had laid out for people your age, and one that most of your peers were walking without ever stopping to question it. At 27, Ben bought a brand new car, a solid one, reasonable by most people's standards, $34,000 financed over 6 years. He rented a 2-bedroom apartment all by himself because he felt he'd earned it. He took 2 vacations every year, paying for them with a travel rewards card and slowly chipping away at the balance over several months afterward. He got a new phone every couple of years, ate out 4 nights a week because he was tired, busy, and felt he deserved it. And he was contributing $100 a month into a target date fund his company's HR department had automatically signed him up for. None of this was reckless behavior. It was simply normal, and in today's economic climate, normal for someone in their late 20s typically meant that the money flowing in and the money flowing out stayed close enough together that whatever gap existed barely had room to grow. You watched all of this unfold, not with judgment, but with the kind of clarity that only comes from having recently run the numbers on exactly what normal costs you over time. Ben's car payment ran $567 every month. Over 6 years, that totaled $40,824, plus the higher insurance premium tied to a newer vehicle, plus the steady depreciation eating away at an asset losing value with every passing year. That same money, invested instead at an average 7% annual return over those same 6 years, would have grown to just over $50,000. On its own, that's not a life-altering figure, but multiply that same pattern across every major financial decision over an entire decade, and that's the exact difference between your life at 35 and his. He has no idea you think about any of this. You've never once said any of it to him, not because you're holding back something useful, but because this kind of math only lands once someone is genuinely ready to work through it themselves. Forcing it on someone who never asked isn't kindness. It's just a way of making yourself feel useful at their expense. The numbers were never the point of your friendship, and it was never your place to hand them over uninvited. You kept the friendship separate from the math, and the friendship is stronger for it. The years stretching from 27 to 34 don't make for a particularly gripping story told from the outside. Nothing dramatic happened. You didn't launch a business or land a lucky investment or fall into some situation that sped up the timeline. You got a raise at 29 and invested every cent of it. You got another one at 31 and did the exact same thing. You kept your rent well below your take-home pay by relocating once to a smaller place in a slightly less convenient part of town, and staying put there for 6 years straight. You drove a 2009 Honda Civic you'd bought outright for $8,400 in cash, and it started up every single morning without a single complaint. There were moments that put the whole plan to the test. One year, the market dropped 24% and your portfolio lost $60,000 in paper value, and you had to consciously resist the urge to sell. Because panic selling during a downturn is exactly how people chasing early retirement end up working until they're 65 instead. There was a promotion offer that came bundled with a relocation to a pricier city, which you turned down because the increased cost of living would have added 2 years onto your timeline, and the title simply wasn't worth that trade. There was a relationship that ended, partly because the person you were with wanted a lifestyle that cost more than the one you were building toward. And you had to sit with the specific grief of a decision you made with total clarity and still didn't want to make. Your savings rate during most of those years hovered between 55 and 65% of your after-tax income. Whenever you shared that number with people, which was rare and only when conversation naturally led there, the reaction was almost always some version of the same question. How do you even live like that? The question assumed a high savings rate meant deprivation, that you were gritting your teeth through some diminished existence just to chase a future number. That assumption was flat out wrong in a way that was hard to convey to anyone who hadn't actually run the experiment themselves. You weren't deprived at all. You'd simply made different choices about what your money was actually for. You cooked at home most nights and genuinely enjoyed it. You took one trip a year instead of two, which meant you planned it more thoughtfully and enjoyed it that much more. You kept a gym membership, made good coffee at home, borrowed books from the library, spent time with friends regularly for free, and lived a life that felt full where it mattered to you and lean where it mostly didn't. That savings rate was never a sacrifice. It was simply an allocation. By the close of 2023, your portfolio had climbed past $960,000. You were 34. Reaching that figure had taken 7 years, which meant 7 years of compounding stacked on top of your contributions, meaning the market had done a genuinely significant chunk of the heavy lifting in those final years, in a way that felt almost surreal after such a slow start. You didn't walk away immediately. You spent 4 months double and triple checking the math from every angle, adjusting for healthcare expenses, running simulations for bad market sequences hitting right at the start of withdrawals, stress testing the 4% rule against history's worst possible stretches. You read everything available about sequence of returns risk, that specific danger of retiring right as the market crashes and draining your portfolio before it gets a chance to recover. You built in extra cushion. You waited until you'd hit 1.05 million, which brought your withdrawal rate down closer to 3.6%, giving you a buffer you could actually feel. Then you handed in your resignation. The HR representative processing it asked if you had another job lined up. You told her you were retiring. She studied you for a moment, glanced back at her screen and said, "Okay, I'll get that processed." You drove home in the Civic, made yourself lunch, sat down on the couch, and felt something entirely different from what you'd expected. Not elation exactly, not relief either. Something quieter and stranger than that. That specific stillness of a weight you'd been carrying for so long, you'd forgotten it was even there, and suddenly it wasn't anymore. Ben called that same evening. You'd already told him you were leaving your job, but not the full story behind it, because the full story needed more time than a random weekday could offer. He asked what your plan was. You told him you weren't sure yet. He said that sounded absolutely terrifying. You told him it didn't feel that way to you at all. He went quiet for a beat, then said, "I think I need to look into some things." That single conversation meant more to you than turning in your resignation ever did. Not because you were trying to convert him to your way of thinking, not because you'd been waiting around for him to ask, but because the real question underneath what he actually said out loud was the exact same question you'd typed into a browser at 27. Whether the life he was building by default was actually the life he'd choose for himself if he understood the trade-offs clearly. That's the only question that really matters, and you were glad it had finally crossed his mind. 4 months into this new life, here's what it actually looks like. You wake up with no alarm. Most mornings you read for an hour, something you'd always meant to do and never had the leftover energy for after work used to drain you. You've started cooking with real intention, not as some hobby project, but simply as the natural outcome of finally having time to shop properly and cook without rushing through it. You work out 4 days a week, not out of sheer discipline, but because you now have the time and energy that your job used to eat up entirely, and your body is doing exactly what bodies naturally do when they aren't exhausted by 7 in the evening. Here's the thing nobody warns you about with early retirement. The first several months are disorienting in ways you never anticipated. Not from boredom, but because the structure your job used to provide, even the parts you resented, was quietly doing something important. The calendar had shape. Days had a built-in reason to begin. Without that scaffolding, you've had to construct your own, which turns out to be harder, more interesting, and occasionally lonelier than you'd expected. You're learning to be the architect of time you never previously controlled, and that turns out to be a completely different skill from the one you spent 8 years mastering. You've had more genuine conversations with people you actually care about in these past 4 months than you had in the previous 2 years combined, simply because you're no longer racing through your days at the pace your job used to demand? And those conversations finally have room to breathe. Your money is doing exactly what you set it up to do. The portfolio sits across 3 index funds: total US market, total international market, and bonds. You rebalance once a year. Last quarter, you withdrew $9,500, right on pace with your $38,000 annual budget. The sequence of returns risk you worried so much about hasn't shown up. The markets have been kind so far, something you're grateful for and definitely not counting on lasting forever. Friends of yours just starting out in their careers look at your life and see nothing but leisure. A few of them assume you must have done something they're not aware of, made some bet that paid off big, gotten lucky in a way the story doesn't fully explain. It's simply easier to believe that than to accept the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is available to literally anyone. And if it's available to anyone, then the uncomfortable question of why they haven't done it themselves is one they'd have to answer on their own. What they can't see, because it's invisible by design, is the 7 years of staying in on Saturday nights instead of going out, the apartment you picked for the price tag instead of the neighborhood, the promotions you chased for the paycheck rather than the title, and that 60% savings rate that made most of those years feel both completely ordinary and quietly meaningful at the same time. They see the morning with no alarm clock. They don't see what actually paid for it, and you're not even sure showing them would help, because the gap between seeing the path laid out and actually choosing to walk it is exactly where most people's financial decisions come to a stop. You're not trying to convert anybody. You have zero interest in telling people what to do with their money or their lives, partly because unsolicited financial advice is one of the fastest ways to make someone feel judged, and partly because the honest version of the advice really just boils down to run the numbers on your own situation and see what they tell you, which isn't something anyone else can do for you. The choices that got you here were specific to your income, your expenses, your appetite for risk, and the particular things you were and weren't willing to give up. None of that automatically transfers to someone else's life, and you wouldn't want it to. What does transfer is the question itself, not the answer. The same question you typed into a browser tab at 27 that turned out to have a real, tangible answer waiting behind it. The question most people never even think to ask because nobody around them is asking it either. And the default path is wide, well-lit, and moving in a direction that feels a lot like forward. Your neighbor pulled out of his driveway at 7:51 this morning. You watched him drive off. You poured yourself a second cup of coffee. You had nowhere you needed to be and nothing waiting on you until you were ready for it, which is either the very definition of freedom or the definition of something you don't have a name for yet. You're still figuring out which one it actually is. You suspect, honestly, it might be both.